Kerby Anderson. Joining me is the weekend edition, and we are so thrilled that you can be with us over the next couple of hours. I will give you a disclaimer. There are so many things that have happened this week. There is no way we will cover all of it in the next 2 hours, and so be aware of that. If later on, even on Monday, you call and say, you didn't talk about, I'll say, well, we'll try to do that on Monday, because there are so many things that have come so quickly, but we will spend as much time as we can on some of the bigger issues. And starting off, of course, you'll see an article we've posted by our friend Ken Blackwell on whether or not the voting in the state of Georgia is, and some of these reforms, whether or not those are racist. We're going to get into the whole issue of tax policy, Second Amendment, gun control, to mention just a few. And if we don't cover all of those topics, and there are many others to get into, including a commission that President Biden wants to form to study whether or not to increase the number in the Supreme Court and to actually have term limits. So Penna, Dexter with me, and Penna, as always, just lots to talk about today.
Well, there is. And then, of course, this morning we saw the news that Prince Philip passed away at 99. So there was another piece of news. But I think, what a lot of this surrounds, at least some of it, is H.R. 1, which we've been talking about on Point of View for quite a while. And the attacks on Georgia's election law, the new laws, in the state of Texas, we're working on one. And in many other states, there are bills. In fact, there are over 300 bills being introduced in legislatures across the country to clean up their elections. And so this move to basically very disingenuously and untruthfully attack these is because if you can get enough people against them, then the need for a national control of our elections under H.R. 1, which completely would negate these laws if they were passed, it becomes highlighted and more apparent. And so I'm a little bit hopeful that what's happening here with all the criticism of the companies that are speaking out against this and pulling, for instance, the All-Star game out of Atlanta, I'm a little bit hopeful that perhaps H.R. 1 will not get the support it might have gotten otherwise.
Dr. Merrill Matthews with us as well. Of course, he's a resident scholar with the Institute for Policy Innovation. A little bit later, we're going to talk about his article about Janet Yellen winning a global corporate tax, as well as this whole issue of taxes and increasing taxes, because this week we've talked about the infrastructure bill that isn't so much about infrastructure and a few other things that we will get into. But Dr. Merrill Matthews, you are aware of the fact that some people have said, well, if Georgia is racist, well, then let's just make the election laws in Georgia like Delaware, because that's where Joe Biden's from.
Absolutely right. I think Democrats are sort of running now because there's been so much pushback, and some of this is just kind of fun. So a state legislator in Georgia has introduced, he says he's introducing legislation. I'm reading this. This is Wes Cantrell, a Republican state legislator in Georgia. And he said he's going to introduce a bill that will be called the President Joe Biden Jim Crow on Steroids Voting Act.
We need some humor.
Where he says he's going to make the Georgia voting laws, I'm quoting, identical to those of his home state of Delaware. And so he says in his 5 key features, and I'm reading this, instead of having up to 19 days of early voting in Georgia, we will have 0 days of early voting, just like Delaware. That's all caps, just like Delaware. Instead of having no excuse absentee voting in Georgia, you will have to have the excuse of being sick or disabled to vote absentee, just like Delaware. Instead of having plenty of secure drop boxes in Georgia, there will be no drop boxes, just like Delaware. He goes on like that, and then he does some about New York City. So it's great fun, and people are having fun with this. But there's also the real side of criticism. Okay, well, Joe Biden, if you don't want to have the game there in Georgia, do you still want the U.S. participating in the Olympics in China, where you don't really have voting for the Communist Party there? The Communist Party decides who's going to be chair, and usually the head of the Communist Party decides who's going to run the country, and it's going to be some pushback there. That it's ridiculous what they're doing, but it's turned into some things that are just a lot of fun. And frankly, the best way to get attention to things is having fun like that, poking fun of it, that people look at it and say, Well, really, that's they'll listen to things that are somewhat have some levity to it, but also make a clear point.
I absolutely agree with that. I think people are really tired of the shouting matches. And, they say so. And I think perhaps, in a sense, some of the divisiveness is why Donald Trump didn't win. And so to have humor and to make fun of it is wonderful. And he took a big step, that state legislature, in doing that. One of the other questions that was asked, and you may have talked about it this week, Kirby, but the head of Delta Airlines is also a member of the golf club where the Augusta Golf Club,
the
where
Masters.
The Masters will be. So, people are wondering, well, what's he going to do? Is he going to drop out of that club? They can't move the Masters golf tournament. So, there's just questions to be asked to expose how, first of all, the fact that people didn't even read the Georgia bill. They didn't really know what was in it. They were just looking for something to support the left on, and they perhaps bow to the pressure of the left on these corporations.
Since we're talking about the Masters for just a minute, Fay Vincent, and you might, if you're a baseball guy, know that he was actually the former commissioner of baseball. That's in the late 80s, early 90s, and he was criticizing the current commissioner, who also is a member of the Augusta Country Club there. Yeah. And so this is, again, just one more issue. Let me just mention, we aren't going to camp out on this one because we have talked a little bit about it this week, but this piece that we've put forward by Ken Blackwell, Penna, you've known him for many years, so have I. I think, well, of course, Dr. Merrill Matthews has as well. He was actually the first African-American elected statewide in the state of Ohio. He served as the Secretary of State, also State Treasurer. At one time, he was the mayor of Cincinnati. African-American, and it was, I think, a very good piece that appeared in USA Today, in which he actually says, claiming that Georgia state voting reforms are racist is ridiculous. And he says, I should know. So it's a piece that we wanted to make available to some of our listeners because in some respects this is going to be a debate that you're probably going to have around the dinner table, around the coffee pot, maybe on Facebook or Twitter. Just one more piece of information for you.
Well, 80% of those surveyed, including a majority of Democrats and non-white Americans, support voter ID for absentee voting. So the other part of this, too, is I really have long thought when we had these debates about voter ID that it's condescending for people to claim that blacks aren't capable of getting a driver's license or some kind of ID, because that's been the reason that, we're suppressing the black vote because they can't somehow manage to get an ID. And so I think that Ken Blackwell, he represents, in a sense, his race in saying, listen, we want ID. We want our vote to count. I mean, anytime there's fraud or just misbehavior in voting, somebody's vote actually loses its power, or they completely lose that vote because it's counteracted by another vote that's cast fraudulently. And I think sometimes we forget that. When you think of it that way, when one person in America, because of one instance of fraud, actually is losing their voice, that's a big deal. Especially when you have a member of Congress who's now sitting there, won by 6 votes. Don't tell me that one vote doesn't matter. 6 votes. Anyway, let's take a break. We have a lot more to cover, and we will do that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Mike Huckabee warns us about the influence of big tech in a recent commentary. He understands that everyone knows that big tech has been in the business of collecting data on each of us to sell to advertisers. But then he asks, did you know they're also selling information about us to federal agencies? He explains that these companies have been collecting data from different services and then use artificial intelligence to understand our personality traits. And apparently the government is using this information to determine how to deal with you within the criminal justice system. Facebook, for example, scoops up information on the 2.4 billion people each month who use the service by tracking their browsing history. When you go online, it can look at the news you read, books you order, and websites you visit. If that is not enough, they are also using a tool called Off Facebook Activity to see your external browsing activity. Google is gathering data to build profiles of people using their interest, location, and demographics. It's also selling this data to third parties. In fact, Google actually purchased two of the biggest third-party ad companies. Through a database called Sensor Vault, Google also sends information directly to law enforcement. And this includes your geographical location, which is collected by cell phone towers and GPS signals. Amazon offers its services to advertisers, which include not only browsing history, but actual purchases and deliveries. And this also includes such information as your delivery address and your credit cards that are used. You know, for many years, critics have said that big tech is beginning to look a bit like Big Brother. That certainly seems to be the case. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Going to talk about taxes, and you might say, why? Well, of course, we're getting to income taxes, but guess what? You don't have to file them on April 15th. You've got a month, or if you're in Texas, you got 2 months, depends on that. But it gets to a conversation we've had this week about the so-called infrastructure bill, which is already at more than $2 trillion. We've had some politicians saying maybe it needs to be $4 trillion, and at least one member of Congress has suggested $10 trillion. That's not going to happen. And then the whole question was how much of it actually is on roads and bridges. You've had the Republicans say, well, 5-6%. White House came back and said, no, if you look at all the things that are infrastructure, maybe it's 25%. Some people try to get it almost up to 50%. But anyway, the big question that many people have, Penna, Dexter, and Dr. Merrill Matthews, is how to pay for it. And that brings us into not only the piece that you've posted, Dr. Merrill Matthews, but just the broader issue of raising the corporate income tax. But this piece that you've posted through IPI.org points out that the Treasury Secretary not only wants to raise the corporate income tax here, but around the world.
She wants to raise it on everybody.
So explain that if you can.
So what they're afraid will happen is if they're able to pass the increase in the U.S. corporate income tax, which is 21% now, used to be 35%. It was changed in the 2017 tax reform bill down to 21%. They want to move it up to 28%. So that'll be basically a 33 and a third percent increase in the tax here. If we do that, they may be crazy, but they're not stupid. They know that sort of opens the door for companies that had been looking at offshoring more of their business or moving their headquarters offshore to another country or something. That will raise that possibility again. So what they want to do is impose a minimum tax around the world. So they're talking to the Organization of Cooperation and Economic Development, trying to get them to go along. And the OECD has been doing this for years. They've been trying to push a minimum tax around the world so that some countries wouldn't offer a lower tax rate to lure businesses there. This is called tax competition. Typically, we like competition. We like businesses competing. We like companies that offer us the same product at a lower price, or maybe it's not quite the same, but it's still a lower price, and we give some choice. We like tax competition among the states. Texas tends to be an attractive state and people move from New York and California to Texas because they get lower taxes. tax competition is a good thing. But what they're hoping to do is sort of minimize or eliminate tax competition by getting other countries around the world, but especially the developed economies, to agree to a minimum tax on corporations. We didn't know early on what this was going to be. As I understand now, Janet Yellen is suggesting a 21% corporate tax. That's about equal to where the European Union is, around 21%.
Right.
But some of the countries there, including Ireland's 12.5%. So Ireland has been a haven for companies moving there because they wanted to get the lower tax rate. In fact, I don't know that our listeners will remember this, but about 5 or 6 years ago, Pfizer was looking at doing what we called an inversion, which means they still keep their headquarters here. They just say their headquarters is in another country, and they were looking at doing that in Great Britain or Ireland in order to be able to get the lower tax rate there. But Donald Trump lowered the tax rate, and so now we've got a good corporate tax rate that's roughly equal to most of the developed economies. And but Biden wants to raise it. So in order to keep that sort of fleeing voting with their feet from companies, they want other countries to adopt a minimum tax so that you can't undercut that.
You know, first of all, when I look at this whole tax plan, because he paid for the last big bill with basically debt. This time they say they're going to pay for it with taxes. And when Trump took office, as you said, the highest tax rate, well, we had the highest tax rate in the world on corporations, 35%
developed countries.
of developed countries. And we had slow economic growth at that time. We had huge regulations, too, that Trump cut. So they cut it down to 21%. But there's something else that happened in that 2017 act, and that is it broadened the tax base in the country. So I think when the tax rates go up under this, it's going to generate a boatload of money. And, you know, to me, that's really scary because it gives them a lot of money with which to accomplish their mischief. But, you know, that being said, I just and I think the infrastructure bill would just reverse much of the good that was done by the 2017 tax cut and also the deregulation that was done by Trump. Maybe some of it will help the infrastructure if some of that deregulation is left in place. I know there's a lot to be talked about on deregulation, but what I want to come back and ask is how likely is it that we are going to be able to either bully or convince countries to actually agree to this bottom rate?
My sense is it's very unlikely because the European Union's been trying to do this for 20 years or so because the European Union would like to have sort of a basic minimum tax on corporations to keep, and even individuals, to keep people from fleeing. When France decided they were going to impose a wealth tax, they saw a lot of their businesses and high-income individuals leave France for other countries there. So they know that people will and companies will vote with their feet, but some countries use this as an attraction, just as some companies do, to try to lower their prices. Walmart comes out, the lowest price always, I think. That's their slogan, to try to attract people from other businesses to come there. So I think it's unlikely that they'll get the high tax countries will be eager to jump on this. I don't think most of the lower tax countries will be eager to jump on it. So Janet Yellen said in her piece in the Wall Street Journal a couple of days ago that the U.S. lost tax revenue once they passed this. So I went and looked at it. It is true that the corporate income tax revenue for the federal government went down somewhat each year, but total revenues went up each year, which is exactly what you'd expect. The companies are paying less in taxes, but they're hiring more people, putting more people to work, paying higher salaries in many cases, adding benefits and other things, and so you see more taxes coming in.
Well, every time you raise taxes on corporations, they never really pay it. They pass it along. And so, you know, it goes to either their employees, don't do as well, or their prices go up. So somebody else pays for it.
Or stockholders. It's the economists debate who actually pays this, but they're generally convinced that the companies themselves don't pay it. They either pass it along in lower salaries, less investment, or others higher prices. So that's where it goes.
Let's talk about the argument right now to pass this tax increase here, because this comes from our friends at the Wall Street Journal, in which you have this claim about they want to end the global race to the bottom. And later on it says the problem, with apologies to Mark Twain, is that the progressive lie about global tax competition has made it around the world before the truth has been able to put its shoes on. And there is a sense in which what you're writing about here in terms of this global corporate tax is also being used right now to say, look, we aren't supposed to follow these other nations that are not making the corporations pay their fair share. We want these countries, these companies in this country to pay their fair share.
That's right. And it's true that a number of countries over the past 30 years have been gradually lowering their corporate tax rate. That's not a race to the bottom. It's in a way to try to attract investment and other companies moving there. It is something that they do. It's like if you're building a home and you're as a home builder and you add some amenities there, you might lower the prices. You do some things to attract customers, and businesses and individuals are customers in a sense when they move to a country. So what's happened now is that the Biden administration, they like price controls. They like price controls on all kinds of things. The minimum wage is a price control on labor. Drug price controls. They're looking at doing all of those things. And this is in essence to try to create a floor of a price control on taxes so that nobody can compete more. And that means everybody could raise taxes.
Well, if nothing else, we're going to take a break, but I think it's just a good illustration of some of the controversy that is going to surround this idea of a tax increase. And we have at least one Democratic member in the United States Senate that says, I don't feel real good about raising corporate taxes. Mm-hmm. So is it possible that we could get a spending program without a tax program? And that could be, again, as Penna points out, just adding more debt, right?
That's the way they usually deal with it. I imagine they're going to get their infrastructure plan, quote unquote infrastructure plan, one way or the other. And I wish they would scale it down a lot, make it true infrastructure if they're going to do it.
Let's take a break. I've been informed, and I probably didn't say it correctly a minute ago, that the National is, of course, where the Masters is. And we will get back to a couple of their issues. We've been talking about taxes and the whole issue of infrastructure. We can certainly stay there, but yesterday the president did have a few things to say about gun control and about Second Amendment, and that one is certainly hot and heavy, and I'd love to certainly get some comments there. And a very good piece by Charles Cook, in which he refers to it as gun control theater. And certainly the actors were there in the Playhouse yesterday, so we'll talk about that right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Dr. Merrill Matthews, Penna, Dexter here today with us. And the third article we've posted here is a very good one by Charles Cook, because he reminds us that when he was actually in the administration, Barack Obama oftentimes would be pushed to do some kind of legislation related to gun control. And then afterwards, there was always this, well, he didn't do that much harm. He managed to do nothing, and this was a way to kind of move the goalpost or move the issue down the field, however illustration you want to use. And so that's why it calls it Biden's gun control theater. We will get into this in some more detail. As a matter of fact, I have a booklet on the Second Amendment to help us understand, if you really want to address, which is a very significant issue of violence and gun violence in America, talking about ghost guns and high-capacity magazines is not where you want to focus your time and attention. So, Penna, what did you find as you started researching some of this?
Yeah, another part of that was what you put on your shoulder to stabilize the rifle. And I mean, those seem like side issues, and something that just doesn't really make a big impact. I will say that, he's encouraging Congress. This is what Charles Cook says. He's encouraging Congress to pass legislation, and that's not going to happen. I mean, in our Senate right now, you wouldn't have the votes to pass really any of the things that Joe Biden has advocated for gun control, or really much of anything of substance. And so, they're just, even with the NRA weakened, which they have been, and some people say, well, this could be a great opportunity for gun control, but I don't think so. I just think there are too many Americans who just see that as an attack on the Second Amendment, number one, but also, in a world where we don't have police in some cities to help us when we have troubles.
Our next article.
Yeah, people want their guns. So I don't think it's not really a vote-winning issue. And so, it's theater. It's theater after some horrible shootings that we've just had.
Of course, he also announces who will be the head of the AFT, which is the American Federation of Teachers? He meant to say ATF. But he said AFT twice. and which, again, you can always stumble occasionally, but Dr. Merrill Matthews...
He stumbles a lot these days.
Yes, and this is why you just... And of course, the person he's putting into the ATF or the AFT, depending on how you want to say it, I've got to have some fun with this, is an individual that has been a staunch gun control activist, an individual that is tied all the way back, we might remember, to the Branch Davidians in Waco and all of that. So there are all sorts of other questions that surfaced out of that press conference. The biggest impediment to Joe Biden actually getting done something through Congress, I would argue, is Joe Biden, and that was true to some extent with Barack Obama as well, because when you start off passing major legislation without any Republican support on it, even though 10 Republicans came and said, we want to work with you on this, on your rescue bill and so forth, and he essentially disregarded them. You create this partisan gridlock that there are some Republicans who I think would be willing to sit down with him for good or ill to discuss where some things can be done, but Joe Biden has sort of pushed we're going my way or the highway, and even though he gives a nod to wanting to be able to do bipartisanship, he says we're going to do bipartisanship, but we're going to do something anyway because something's got to be done. So if you're not willing to agree with me on stuff, then we're going to move forward with it anyway, and that has just poisoned the well.
What do you think he would do by executive order on guns? Would he do anything?
You're talking about Biden?
Yes.
Well, of course, he's trying to do that. And interestingly, the question is whether or not states have to go along with it. That question has been raised. And my understanding, Governor Abbott yesterday said we as a state, he wants us to become a sanctuary state with regard to Second Amendment rights. And as I understand, that means the state doesn't have to go along with him on various things. The state can impede federal officers from doing their job. job that might be influenced by an executive order. But it would be interesting because we saw these sanctuary cities and states pop up with regard to immigrants, especially illegal immigrants. And it'll be interesting to see if we have some pop up with regard to the Second Amendment rights.
The other question is, of course, what the Supreme Court would do with any of those actions, because there's obviously going to be some action there, and you have what's called the Heller decision and some others that have come down, one from Washington, D.C., one from Chicago, which already seem to establish that the Second Amendment is something that is not just for the militia, it's for an individual right. And so now that raises another question I want to go around the table on, and that is the argument being used by President Biden that any of the Bill of Rights is not absolute. Any thoughts about that?
I heard him say that. He wants to say the rights that we have are not absolute, and and then he uses the I think the fire in a theater sort of thing to say you don't have an absolute right to free speech. That's generally true. On the other hand, it sounds like we're working to try to get around our rights that we have in the Constitution. So I think it's a bit disconcerting about where he wants to go with this, but whatever he does, I think will get challenged, and we'll see where the Supreme Court goes with it.
Yeah, and I'm thinking that's what may happen on some of these big actions he wants to take that are unconstitutional, that will just be it'll wind up in the courts. There'll be 2 years of it, and then we'll have our congressional elections. It'll actually probably help. All this overreach will probably help the Republicans win the House and perhaps keep the Senate, and maybe get a few more senators. We'll see. But it could, in a sense, the overreach can help, and also a president usually loses members of Congress in their first midterm election afterwards. Plus, Nancy Pelosi is losing a lot of her people just because they're being appointed to cabinet positions. So, I don't know. It's a scary, scary time because of the socialist bent of so many people that are influencing this president. And I actually am very disturbed that he makes so many mistakes and doesn't seem with it, because I think if Joe Biden were the Joe Biden of 20 years ago, we would not be going down this path of socialism that we're heading down.
It's interesting when you talk about the mistakes, because I believe he said in the conference that there are no background checks at gun shows.
Okay.
Wow.
And that's just absolutely not the case. And so I don't know where he's getting this information, because he said a lot of misstatements about the Georgia law,
right,
and other things, and then people come up and correct him. Even the Washington Post and others are coming up saying 4 Pinocchios here.
Yes.
You didn't get some of this stuff right, but he sometimes keeps saying it, and so I don't know if it just hasn't connected, but it's not looking good, because there's already questions about his alertness these days, right, let's just say. And if you keep making mistakes like this, it feeds that.
Right. And again, back to the point, yes, let's acknowledge that the previous president, Donald Trump, want to say some pretty bizarre things and use some hyperbole, but usually somebody would sort of back him off the cliff. And Joe Biden keeps saying the same thing as if no one ever corrected him. I don't know how you get 4 Pinocchios from Glenn Kessler at the Washington Post and then say the same thing the next day.
Yes.
And the next day, and the next day after that, and the same thing here. Like you said, there were so many misstatements about the Second Amendment. And we'll open up the phones, because I'm sure some of our Second Amendment experts will want to weigh in with some of their comments. First of all, how hard is it to actually make a ghost gun? I'll go into that if somebody really cares. And how having a brace on a gun is going to do anything when almost 50% of all the people murdered by handguns all took place in 2% of the counties of the United States. There are some really dangerous places in this country, and they're in places like Chicago and South Central LA and a variety of other places like that. And that's where, if you're really concerned about gun violence, you need to put your time, effort, and resources, and that's not what was being discussed yesterday.
Let me just come back and say I'm not surprised at all that Joe Biden comes back and says the same thing again, because that's how the left operates sometimes. They say it again and again, and they use the talking points. They're counting on people not caring what the Washington Post says or even knowing what the Washington Post says. They just have a certain sector of the electorate, which is huge, who will believe those talking points, and they just count on that. And it doesn't have to be true.
Yeah.
But they'll just say it over and over.
Well, if you say it enough times, it becomes truth, right? At least for some people's minds. But there are a lot of things that we will certainly be talking about in the next couple of weeks as it relates to this issue of gun control and the Second Amendment. But most importantly, did want to mention that. And if you'd like to join the conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. And when we come back, some of you might say, okay, well, then how are we going to address violent crime? Well, here's a thought, and this gets to our next article. Maybe you shouldn't defund the police in those cities where violent crime is going up significantly. We'll talk about that right after this.
The Equality Act has passed the House of Representatives and awaits a Senate vote. It's a priority for the president, who says he wants it passed in his first 100 days. The law makes sexual orientation and gender identity protected categories under civil rights law. Elevating public protections for LGBTQ activities diminishes protections for religious people and organizations. The Equality Act would define much of what churches and religious people and organizations do as public accommodations. So, religious schools, hospitals, and other ministries would be forced to operate under a gender ideology that violates the core of what they believe. They'd be required to take actions they know would seriously harm other human beings. Among them, the perpetration of medical atrocities on people uncomfortable with their God-given gender. The Equality Act is an egregious assault on religious liberty, but it goes further. It's an attack on what everyone sees. Margaret Harper McCarthy is a professor at John Paul II Institute. Her recent Wall Street Journal op-ed is entitled, "The Equality Act is at War with Reality." At stake, she writes, is the freedom of rational human beings to use a common vocabulary when speaking about what all can see. This is not about theological beliefs like the Trinity. Rather, she writes, the Equality Act concerns things everyone can see and understand. Nursing babies know their mothers are the ones nursing them, not their fathers. Sexual difference is obvious. If truths about the human body are only beliefs, Professor McCarthy wonders, why object so vociferously to these particular beliefs? Her answer, because they make especially strong claims on us. There's a revolution that denies the obvious, denies the visible reality of two sexes, male and female. Its goal is to eliminate the distinction between the sexes. The professor says it is now at the doorstep. Believers should prepare, because those who believe in the invisible order are now the last custodians of the visible one. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, and let me just mention as a program note that we haven't gotten into a number of issues, and we will cover those next hour. Got a very good piece here called Wealthy and Woke. We also have some material about whether or not the president would like to establish a commission to not only increase the number on the Supreme Court, but have term limits on the Supreme Court. So we'll get into that. And I thought it'd be helpful as well to mention that this week we have covered a little bit of the pushback after the 60 Minutes piece on the governor of Florida. And of course, that also relates to the fact that there have been some comments about the governor of Texas. So we'll get into all those next hour. We have a lot to cover. But the article that I mentioned is one that came out recently. Violent crime spike in cities that defunded the police, burned out cops leaving in droves. Penna, Dexter, this one I wanted to put up there because it provides the documentation for what I think almost anybody with common sense would have figured out was going to happen. Once you start talking about defunding the police, even if you don't defund them and just lower that, the lack of morale is enough to mess up and hurt the police department. And as we begin to look at these cities where that has taken place, it's been a disaster.
It's been a disaster. 20 major cities have slashed their police budgets. This is according to Fox News. Portland, Los Angeles, Oakland, New York, Seattle, Chicago, Minneapolis, and Austin. The police officers that remain are overworked. They're saying they're burned out. Sometimes they're just leaving because they aren't supported. That's happening a lot.
High attrition rate.
Right. High attrition rate. Why would you want to be a police officer? Put your life on the line. It's even more dangerous now. And you're not getting the support. As a matter of fact, you're getting the officials that actually are above you disdaining you and publicly mocking or critiquing you. So, it goes, the article's good because it goes city after city of all these cities I mentioned and talks about how much money was defunded. New York, it was $1 billion that was defunded from the police. And what's happened as a result. And it's devastating. And it needs to be turned around. I mean, Austin, Texas is one of them. And I know our governor's calling. In fact, he wants to put some carrots, I think, for them to refund the police. What they say a lot of times when they defund is it's going to go to something else, some kind of community efforts. But there's nothing like the deterrent force of the police who can come to help you when you're in trouble or your home is being burglarized or, the many things that can happen. Maybe police are doing too much in some ways, trying to have to mediate domestic disputes and things like that. And maybe they need to call in help for that. But we need armed police who can keep the peace.
And my understanding is, and I haven't seen this myself, but my understanding from the people who track gun sales and so forth is that women and minorities are buying more guns in bigger proportions than they used to, simply because of things that are going on in Portland and other places, and they feel, you had whole parts of the city in some of those areas just wiped out, especially in minority areas, and that they feel like if the police aren't going to be there, I've got to have something to protect myself, and especially true with women. And Portland, the riots are continuing there in Portland. It's just a mess.
Let me give Portland as an example because this one goes on for many pages, but murders in Portland have tripled from July 2020 to February 2021. So just think of the tripling of the murder rate in Portland. Mm-hmm. And that's because the city commissioners voted to cut nearly $16 million from the police budget at a time, as you just mentioned, Dr. Merrill Matthews, where we have kind of an ongoing riot every single day in the particular city of Portland, which is now morphed into other places. I think they had some controversy in Bend and a variety of other places that I've read about, and who knows where else. Salem, of course, that's another place where they've had some controversy. So then you start saying, okay, what did the people that were in the police force say? And they had 31 brutally frank exit interviews. Yes. But my favorite one, which again, it's sad to say this, says the only difference between the Titanic and the Portland Police Bureau are deck chairs and a band. This thing is going down. And that's Portland, Oregon, which you would think would be probably more likely than any other because they've had ongoing riots. You've had riots for a long time in places like Minneapolis and other places, but they really never ended in Portland. That would be, you would think, a time when you would never want to cut back the police force just to try to control some of the mayhem that takes place almost every night.
Another place that should have people scratching their heads is Chicago. Chicago is famous for its murder rate. Why would they cut the police force? And when they did, they voted last summer to, quote unquote, redirect money from arresting people and locking them up to housing, health care, and job creation. And so the shooting, the killing and the murders went way up in Chicago. No big surprise there
And we don't know how the George Floyd case is going to come out, but if the police officer is found not guilty, I suspect we'll see another round of disturbances in cities around the country.
And they won't be ready for it, a lot of them.
And again, Windy City is a good example. They're in Chicago, up 33%. Homicides up 33%. Shootings went up 40% in the same period. And, of course, we've even seen that as an example because when they were actually deploying some of the police force to deal with some of those protests and even riots, but we'll call them protests, then they were taking police from other parts of the city, and that's where the looting was taking place, the burglaries are taking place, because you have sometimes with a police force, because you only have so many individuals, it's a zero-sum game. So if you move police over to one part of the city, all of a sudden everybody realizes there's nobody here, and it basically becomes a Thunderdome or something like that.
It just opens the door. Criminals are rational.
Yes.
They looked at that. That's why you typically don't. The riots were a little bit different, but typically you don't have people doing major robberies right next to the police station. They know that. They understand the odds, and they make certain calculations. And so if you drain the police from other places or you drain the police force, it opens the door for criminal minds, and that's a small percentage of the population, but there are people who are criminals.
So also, one of the things that has driven down crime in various cities, like think about Rudy Giuliani in New York with the broken windows policies, the protective type of policing. Well, when you defund the police department, you get little to none of that. And so you don't prevent crimes. And so, that's too bad. I mean, so that the crime rate is going up partially because of that.
Well, it's certainly the case. And again, broken windows, we talk about that in the biblical point of view on criminal justice, because I take you through some of the history of that, because that was used in New York City. And it worked very well for Rudy Giuliani. And then later on, people said, we won't worry about things like vandalism. And once you have one broken window, you have another broken window. Once you start breaking windows, people start breaking into cars, right?
Yeah, and one of the things you're seeing is essentially the decriminalizing of crime across the country, as various large cities have said, we're not going to hold people accountable, including Dallas. If somebody breaks into a store and takes up to, I think it was $750 worth, we're not going to prosecute that. Well, that means I can take $749 worth, and I'm fine.
We will take some of your phone calls, but we are coming up to a break. And back to what Dr. Merrill Matthews was saying, if you don't think that criminals are intelligent, sometimes they're not the smartest individual or the sharpest knife in the drawer, but they do understand that. I have never seen an armed robbery at a gun store. And again, there are some very important issues that you need to pay attention to, and that's why this issue of a deterrence is so important. And when you don't have police officers out on a beat, it's more likely that individuals that intend harm or want to take advantage of that will do so. But let's take a break. That is, of course, one of our articles today. Violent crime spikes in cities that defunded the police. No surprise there, but we have a lot more to cover, and we'll take some phone calls right after these important messages.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour here on Point of View, and we have in studio with us today Penna, Dexter, and Dr. Merrill Matthews. And if you find yourself saying, boy, you went through some of that pretty quickly, I'd like to read it for myself or have access to it so I can pass it on to others. Our third and fourth articles that we talked about last hour on certainly gun control and then also the issue of violent crime are on the website. But let me mention some other things. We do have this booklet I produced a number of years ago, and it's a biblical point of view on the Second Amendment. Takes you through some of the arguments, though, there as relates to it. And then this one here, a biblical point of view on criminal justice. A minute ago, you heard Penna Dexter mention the broken window theory, and that's in there, as well as some of the key principles about punishment, crime, deterrence, and the rest. So those are some resources so that if you find yourself in a conversation or you want to read it for yourself to check it out, that's what we encourage you to do, and it's all available at the website, pointofview.net. If you'd like to join the conversation, we've been talking about the police. We're going to move on to some other topics in just a minute, but let's head out to California first. And Mark, thank you for joining the conversation today.
Hi. I had a comment about the law enforcement. Years ago, I was at a bar. I was supposed to go with my wife to a little ice cream parlor and get raisin rum ice cream and look at kites on the wall and figure out for a time. And I went to a party instead. And I became the party. And then I went out on the road, and it was late night, early morning, and the law down there in San Bernardino, the police saw me, and they chased me up on the freeway. I didn't even know they were chasing me. I was drunk. I was drunker than William Holden is what they said with their test. But they took me off the road, and I fought them. I was bobbing my head, they said. I guess I got out of the car, and, it took four of them to bring me down. And I was all beat up, and my mother was livid. But anyways,
they probably saved your life.
Turned my life. They saved my life. And that same night, it was in the police thing in the paper. A guy had swallowed a bag of marijuana, and they did everything they could to save him. And people said they were doing things to him, but I don't believe it. I believe that the police do everything they can to save our lives, and we fight them. And everybody, people are taking pictures, but they're not taking the real story. And if you put your knee on a guy's neck, that's not his throat. And if he swallowed a bag of stuff just ahead of that, maybe that's what choked him out. Maybe that's why he couldn't breathe. That's all I'm saying. We shouldn't take what the media is saying at face value. We should check the facts and let the courts try them, not the media.
Well said. And there have been a couple of cases, and I'm not sure if the one with George Floyd fits in the category, but there's some others where when you see the rest of the story, you realize that there are some things that aren't covered. So sometimes you think, well, I can see it, yes, but I don't see what preceded it, and I don't necessarily see some of the elements, and that's why this rush to judgment in the press hasn't really been a very good thing.
And, there are some cases of police abuse. Police sometimes do bad things, but that does seem to be, as far as I can tell, a very small percentage. And we have a new police chief in Dallas, and I know the first speech he made, he said nobody hates a bad cop more than a good cop. And sure. I think I think the vast majority of them tend to be good cops. They make mistakes and they make errors in judgment, and then sometimes we find out that the accusations against them were just completely false. I mean, you may remember there was I think she's a University of Texas, North Texas professor who was walking in Denton, an African American woman. She was pulled over by the police. She ran an op-ed in the Dallas Morning News talking about how they harassed her and were racially making racial allegations or something, and then so they released the video cam of the dash cam from the police car. And you look at that and you think, sometimes you could see something that I don't see. No rational person could see what she said happened in that video. It was just absolutely a false accusation.
It reminds me of a phrase which we're going to use now when we talk about 60 Minutes, Proverbs 18:70. The first to state his case seems right until the other comes back and cross-examines him. Mm-hmm. And there is a sense in which sometimes you think you know what you know, and then when you have the opportunity to more objectively evaluate that is the case. So I'm going to use that to get us into 60 Minutes because Penna, Dexter, you and I have talked about this before, that there certainly are some questions about the way in which the press covers various issues. But at the same time, I've said this week that there are some that are sort of in the pantheon of journalistic ideas and ideologies, and that would be Edward R. Murrow and Walter Cronkite and Ted Koppel's Nightline, and 60 Minutes has been into that. And this week, I think we have found out that the 60 Minutes story on the governor, Ron DeSantis, has been something that was incredibly deceptive. What have you found?
It was deceptive. It's sad to see 60 Minutes as one that we trusted. We all sitting around here grew up with 60 Minutes, at least for part of our home life before we were adults, and so we became used to that program and those reporters. But it looks like Ron DeSantis, it was a critique of him basically for giving special preference for Publix grocery stores around the area to vaccinate people, and so he was accused of pay-to-play type of stuff. And there was video footage involved with this. And so, when we come back and really look at it, we find that there was a clip and the middle of it was basically cut out to send a whole different message. And so, it's the governor came out with a defense of himself, which I think he needed to do in this case because it's just absolutely not fair. And then we've also had YouTube pulling the video, so you can't, trying to keep people from seeing the truth. And I think this governor, he's going back and he's actually repairing his reputation that was so unfairly tarnished.
I think the story of the last decade or two is how the media have just completely abrogated any kind of journalist. I used to actually teach some journalistic ethics. Yes. They've just abandoned those completely now, and it's amazing to me. I listen to BBC America on the radio. I can't tell you what their position is. I mean, I think they do a very, very good job. I couldn't tell you what their position is and when they're doing it. They give both sides a hard time. But when I listen to NPR almost every day, the host, in my opinion, have just completely gone over. And if they have a leftist on there, it's almost like they're just, I'm so happy you're joining us. And then they'll go and just attack the conservative that comes on. It's a dramatic change than what we grew up with.
I want to take a break. When we come back, I want to get some comments around the table because you have the anchor for NBC, Lester Holt, who has said that really fairness is overrated. And the idea that we should give two sides equal weight and merit, I think I already know where Dr. Merrill Matthews has come with that laugh, does not reflect the world we find ourselves in. And I'll set it up now because he said, the fact that the sun sets in the west is a fact and any contrary view does not deserve our time and attention. Oh, well, I think we all agree with that. But then he goes on to say decisions to not give unsupported arguments equal time are not a dereliction of journalistic responsibility or some kind of agenda. In fact, it's just the opposite. I want to get your comments about that. When you're saying, we don't need to be fair anymore. We figured out what's true, and we'll just tell you that. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Mike Huckabee warns us about the influence of big tech in a recent commentary. He understands that everyone knows that big tech has been in the business of collecting data on each of us to sell to advertisers. But then he asks, did you know they're also selling information about us to federal agencies? He explains that these companies have been collecting data from different services and then use artificial intelligence to understand our personality traits. And apparently, the government is using this information to determine how to deal with you within the criminal justice system. Facebook, for example, scoops up information on the 2.4 billion people each month who use the service by tracking their browsing history. When you go online, it can look at the news you read, books you order, and websites you visit. If that is not enough, they are also using a tool called Off Facebook Activity to see your external browsing activity. Google is gathering data to build profiles of people using their interest, location, and demographics. It's also selling this data to third parties. In fact, Google actually purchased two of the biggest third-party ad companies. Through a database called Sensor Vault, Google also sends information directly to law enforcement. And this includes your geographical location, which is collected by cell phone towers and GPS signals. Amazon offers its services to advertisers, which include not only browsing history, but actual purchases and deliveries. And this also includes such information as your delivery address and your credit cards that are used. You know, for many years, critics have said that big tech is beginning to look a bit like Big Brother. That certainly seems to be the case. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, you know, one of the reasons we encourage you to listen to Point of View is that there is a fair amount of media bias out there. And Lester Holt was trying to make a case that, you know, sometimes these facts are so obvious you don't need to provide an alternative viewpoint. But then he jumps from the obvious. I think, is there anybody that denies that the sun sets in the west? That's just a little bit different. And this got to be too much for Britt Hume, who, of course, used to be with ABC News and now with Fox News. And on Twitter, he said, you know, this argument from Lester Holt rests on the proposition that the media always knows the truth. But they don't, as their own network's coverage of the bogus and implausible Russia collusion tale illustrates. Not to mention the media's reporting of early COVID-19 advice that turned out to be wrong. Dr. Merrill Matthews is going to help us with that in just a minute. And then he goes on to say, look, if one side says the White House is made of powdered milk and the other disagrees, well, we can safely ignore the milk claim. But political disputes are rarely so cut and dried, so we report what both sides are saying and let viewers and readers make up their own minds. And I think we can all agree that the sun sets in the west and the White House is not made of powdered milk. But at the same time, this is being now used to say we're not going to give any kind of alternative view on climate change. We're not going to look at some of the possible negatives of the pandemic lockdowns. And Dr. Merrill Matthews, that's part of the problem, isn't it?
That's right. Yeah, they're essentially asserting their values in there. And I hear it so often. And I'm going back to National Public Radio, I hear them frequently when Donald Trump was in there saying Donald Trump is making false claims about such and such. Well, you don't have to. I mean, now you've sort of prejudiced the listener as to whether or not they may be false, but you prejudice the listener. And I don't hear the media doing that with Joe Biden.
Or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
Right. I mean, even when Joe Biden makes what is obviously a false claim, they don't preface their statement with it by saying he made the false statement or the false claim that such and such. And it's just the mainstream media have become so biased these days that it's just almost impossible to listen to them if you follow these things very closely, because you can just hear the bias coming in.
You can, and it is fortunate we have other sources of news. People can find their own news. There's some people say it's a shame that we can't all be watching the same news. But the thing is that these anchors, they just exhibit a sort of arrogance now. And that's one thing. But it's even worse when they also have the attitude that Lester Holt portrayed about truth. If you cannot trust them for the truth, you're certainly going to go find your own. And yeah, we are tribal. We're divided because we really frequent different sources now for our information. We have to. The mainstream media has forced that.
What about COVID-19? I want to get into your comments about that. First of all, there has been an incredible criticism of the governor, Ron DeSantis, and some people pointing out part of it is because he won an election people didn't think he was going to win. He's been kind of a Trump-type supporter, and most importantly, he lifted the mask mandate very early. But I've got one here in which it points out that also the governor of Texas, that'd be Greg Abbott, lifted the mask mandate. And so you have the former San Antonio mayor, Julian Castro, saying that this is desperate political games. The California governor, Gavin Newsom, said it was reckless. Beto O'Rourke said it's actually a death warrant for the state. And then lo and behold, you look at the actual case numbers for places like Texas and Florida, two of the most populous states in the country. And they've done relatively well.
And even some of the media have come up and said, well, okay, we're going to have to concede that Florida didn't do as badly as we thought. In fact, they actually did better than most of the states we've been highlighting as the great states out there. and this is the changing nature of some of this. And even with the Centers for Disease Control, they released a statement this week which said that they've now concluded that it looks like it's very, very unlikely that somebody can get COVID-19 from touching something that somebody else has touched that had COVID. And we've gone through over a year now of sterilizing everything we touch, with people coming in and sterilizing everything you touched after you leave. And yet the CDC says now the chances are likely 1 in 10,000 or less that you would catch COVID from something that somebody with COVID had touched. I'll take those odds. Those are pretty good odds. And yet, you and I know we've gone back here for if we were questioning whether or not we need to be sterilizing everything we touched 6 months ago, 8 months ago, you and I would be accused of being anti-science and and it's because the nature of this changes and science changes at times, and they say this was our best information at one point. Now with more information, we think it's probably this. Now in another year, they may flip again, but that's reasonable. But what happens is the politicians and the epidemiologists and others tend to make this as this is the way it is, period. And you can't question us. And then the politicians come in and say any questioning that is denying the science. And now we're increasingly seeing any social media that comes up and says you're denying the science, we're going to ban you and your presentation or your thoughts can't be included.
That's what I was going to mention, that the social media has then reinforced the idea that, this is the truth. Even though it's only the truth for this week. It's the truth for this week. But you're going to get canceled if you say otherwise. It's interesting with this DeSantis story, too, because there was an attempt to block from YouTube the whole full interview that was uncut with DeSantis, and other times when he met with people that would inform his thinking on how to handle COVID-19 in various ways. So, if you can understand how a governor makes those decisions, I think that helps you. And because where the left is trying to portray him as a careless politician that's putting lives at risk, no, he spent a lot of time, probably more than most, meeting with people and with experts and finding out facts so that he could make his decisions. With this whole idea of who was going to do this big push on vaccinations, and they went to Publix. He also went out to the stores and met with people who were getting their shots there. He wanted to find out about reactions and how people were doing. I mean, this is a governor who has worked hard to get it right. You may not agree with him, but to cut off the ability for a politician to communicate with the public on his reasoning why you do something is since we have so much ability to see these things now because of all the technology we have, they're having to really employ terrible cancel tactics and censorship.
I spent 10 years on the Institutional Review Board for Human Experimentation. That's a medical school's review board that reviews the human experiments that go on there. And I was the only non-scientist there. These were all doctors and scientists in the group. And when on various types of issues that come up, you would sometimes have some disagreement. Sometimes you would have sharp disagreement. I would listen to these things, but it was a great forum for people going back and forth as they expressed their opinions about things. But anybody who sits on that for a while knows not all scientists agree with everything, and sometimes there are very good opinions on the other side, and you don't necessarily know which one's going to play out, but you know there's good, knowledgeable people making cases.
What about the frontline physicians, for example, that are not allowed to be on YouTube, or where some of their testimony has been removed, even sometimes in a Senate hearing has been removed? Now, if again the people pulling that off from YouTube or Amazon or Google or whatever have the medical degrees like the people that you sat on that committee with, that's one thing. But I got the sense that some of them have no more scientific expertise than the local broadcaster, and they're the ones deciding what goes on the YouTube channel or what doesn't go on the YouTube channel.
That is many times the case, and the bizarre aspect of this is people have pointed out, the Ayatollah in Iran was able to keep his Twitter account, and they would deny the Holocaust. They would deny just about everything that we as Christians believe, and yet they were able to keep going.
Well, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll get into some other issues. But again, it's just an illustration, I think, really of this whole issue of media bias and why we need to get more information. By the way, next week we'll get into some other ones. You know, World Health Organization now saying, no guarantee that vaccines prevent COVID-19 transmission. And you got to remember, this time last year, I mentioned this to you off air, but it's worth mentioning on air, we were actually bringing people on to talk about the fact that there is some benefit to masks when we were hearing from the Surgeon General and others, oh, no, don't get masks, because actually they didn't want us to go out and buy masks, right?
They didn't want to use up the supply of masks so they could be in the hospitals, but they didn't tell us that. I think that they should have been honest with the American people. Then people would have been more likely to adopt masking and not so critical of it when they did change their tune.
Yeah, Jerome Adams and Anthony Fauci were just saying, no, we don't want you to get masked. And we were going, no, I think they're not perfect, but they probably are better than nothing. And then eventually they switched around. Now, if you don't have a mask, well, you're trying to kill people. Anyway,
you got to wear two of them.
And now you need 3 masks.
Yeah, we'll be right back.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You're listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour. Let me just mention, if you'd like to join the conversation, we'll take those phone calls in just a minute. 1-800-351-1212. Our last article we'll get to sometime this half hour, Wealthy and Woke by Victor Davis Hanson, which relates to a conference that we mentioned earlier in the week. We had Dr. Owen Strachan on, and we talked about wokeness and the gospel. We have given you a link to that already. It's Wokeness and Gospel. It's June 11th and 12th. It is at Denton Bible Church. It's your church, as a matter of fact. Dr. Merrill Matthews and Charles was here with Owen, and I think they already have 500 people coming to this Wokeness conference. It'll be
really a big
amazing
group, and I suspect it'll be available online as well. So people, if you can't make it to Texas, people will be able to watch it.
But again, I'm hoping a lot of people will, because we think it may be the first, if you will, kind of Christian conference on wokeness.
It's 2 months out, and they've got a very large attendance rate already, so it may pack the church. It's a good sized church.
I just have to applaud Tommy Nelson and Denton Bible Church for doing a conference like that. I hope many more churches will follow suit and do this. It's a big misunderstanding in the church.
Just before I take some phone calls, though, I wanted to get into a couple of things. First of all, the president also said he wants to form a commission to study packing the Supreme Court. And I didn't say it that way. He just says, maybe we want to help them out.
But that's what he meant.
They're overworked. And he also maybe wants to investigate whether or not to have term limits on the Supreme Court. And so if you have more liberals on the Supreme Court, that's one issue. The other part of that, Dr. Merrill Matthews, the last time we had you in, we talked about your piece, and people can still find it at ipi.org, which is March 25th, fixing, I should say, the filibuster the Jimmy Stewart way. Jimmy Stewart played Jefferson Smith.
Jefferson Smith.
Yes. And yet the filibuster right now still exists, but the history illustrates the fact that maybe there could be a movement to actually change that, and then all sorts of legislation right now that's passed the House that has very little chance of passing the Senate could fly right through, couldn't it?
Right, yeah. The filibuster is not a constitutional provision. That was something that was adopted both the House and Senate in their rules of procedures, and it's gone back and forth where they've basically the filibuster is an issue that allows for continuous debate until somebody is able to close it off. And the rules of how you do that, how you shut off debate, have changed over time. And that's understandable. It's part of their debate. In 1975, they made some changes there, which changed the number of people who could close debate. But they also allowed for what we call these days a virtual filibuster. So you used to have to stand up in the well of the Senate, as Jimmy Stewart did, and Mr. Smith goes to Washington. That allowed for people just to a senator to essentially put a hold on and inform the Senate Majority Leader that he or she is going to filibuster something, but they don't have to stand up and do it. And as a result, I call it the lazy senator's filibuster, because you don't have to do anything but just inform the majority leader. And so the majority leader cannot bring that up until he or she has 60 votes to be able to override it. And it allows for an awful lot of things to be filibustered. And we've seen a whole lot of filibusters come through because
both sides.
On both sides, absolutely. And so because that has blocked a lot of things, they've increasingly looked for ways to get around it. And that's where we come up with the reconciliation bill, which passed back in the 70s, I think, if I remember right, but really wasn't used to try to get around legislation until the 90s. And now it's become a key tool, and Democrats have said it's been used again. Both sides have used we used the reconciliation process to get the 2017 tax reform legislation through. Barack Obama used it to get the Obamacare passed, and now they recently used it to get the relief bill passed. And the question is whether or not they can continue using it. Normally, the reconciliation only allows for one a year because you're doing it for the budget. But they found a provision in there, Democrats did. They went to the Senate parliamentarian. She said, I think you can probably use it. So they may end up allowing a number of times for the reconciliation. So you used to have to sort of be judicious as to when you used it. Maybe not so much anymore if they can come back and retweak reconciliation bills that they've already done.
Okay, so when you do reconciliation, for instance, most recently in the $1.9 trillion stimulus bill, the one part of it that we were happy did not get included was a minimum wage of $15, and that was because it didn't fit into the rules for reconciliation. So what are those rules?
Those rules mean that it has to apply. It has to have a significant impact on the budget. It can't be a marginal impact on the budget. So you can spend. It can be tax related. It could be spending related. But it has to have some major impact. And even though the minimum wage might have meant more federal tax coming in from people making higher incomes, it was considered to be non-consequential, and so it was left out.
So the other thing to explain then is who gets to change the rules for filibuster? Is it the Senate voting on their own rules?
Yes.
If so, we've got two senators on the Democrat side that are this week both made very clear statements that they would not get rid of it.
Right. And if they hold with that, because Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia has what sounded like a little bit of a waffle 2 or 3 weeks ago, willing to allow some changes, but he's been very, very adamant in the last few days that he doesn't want to change in there. Senator Kirsten Sinema from Arizona has essentially said the same thing. Not, I think, as radically as he has, but that's
he's got a long history of supporting the filibuster, and so it would be a big deal for Joe Manchin to go back on that, although he's been known to do that.
But remember, in the piece that I had, the reforming the filibuster the Jimmy Stewart way, fixing the filibuster the Jimmy Stewart way. In 2017, I think it was, you had 61 senators sign legislation which said that they opposed ending the filibuster. 32 of those were either Democrats or an independent. Most of them are still, all but 5 of them are still in the Senate, and they signed legislation to the majority and minority leaders saying, we adamantly oppose ending this. And so 30-something senators have largely flipped.
So if they did do away with the filibuster as it stands right now, I mean, this could change our country. It would not only change the rules for the Senate, which they already did with regard to the judiciary and the Supreme Court.
And the nominees.
And the nominees. But for legislation, it still stands. But the things that would happen if they got rid of it, number one, we talked at the beginning of the show about H.R. 1, change our whole election system and nationalize it. And there's just a long laundry list of things that it would do that would place the left in power for the foreseeable future. And, Republicans may never win another presidential election if we get H.R. 1. D.C. statehood. So you get 2 states, Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C., and you get 4 more Democrat senators. The Equality Act, which basically is just, it destroys religious liberty with regard to sexuality and a lot more. And then also, of course, just the idea of packing the Supreme Court. And that's another one that would solidify the left's power.
And, of course, the issue is if you do that, then the next time Republicans control the House and Senate and the White House, which may not be that far off, they could turn around and easily reverse those on a majority vote. One of the benefits of the filibuster is it creates a little more stability in being able to repeal legislation. We couldn't repeal Obamacare, so I wish we had, but it does create a little bit more stability and long-lastedness just because it's hard to get past it.
Well, and again, just think of all the pieces of legislation that were passed without one Republican vote. One of those was, of course, the Affordable Care Act. Another one, of course, is the stimulus bill. And there are all sorts of bills that Penna just mentioned. And by the way, if you have not already contacted your 2 senators about the Equality Act, that's the action item here. You might want to do that today because we're going to change it out to some of those others, including, since we earlier were talking about this whole issue of gun control, there are 2 pieces of legislation that passed the House related to gun control that are sitting before the Senate. There's a piece that essentially is amnesty, an immigration bill that's passed the House and in the Senate. So if you don't have the filibuster, Katie, bar the door, to use a phrase that we've used around here a couple of times, it would be so different than anything we've seen here before.
Right, because legislation would move. Once you control the House and Congress, you can move almost anything through. And so the Senate has been sort of the barrier to ill-advised or knee-jerk reactions to legislation.
They've always been that, and that was one tool for them to use to give the minority some say in just negotiating better law and policy.
Well, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, I want to get into wokeness for just a minute, if you don't mind. And this is a piece by Victor Davis Hanson. He starts out by talking about the chief executive officer for Delta Airlines, which is the largest employer in the state of Georgia. And you would think he wouldn't want to do anything to affect those people that might actually want to book a flight on his airline, especially given the fact that in order to even check in, you have to use a photo ID, right? Isn't that right? They have to use, which was one of the things he thinks it's racist of asking for people to use in the vote. So I wanted to get into that, and this is a piece by Victor Davis Hanson. Of course, it relates very much to this conference we've talked about. And also then, what about this? Princeton limits white male admissions to only 14%. Well, that's kind of wokeness too. So we'll get into all those issues right after this.
The Equality Act has passed the House of Representatives and awaits a Senate vote. It's a priority for the president, who says he wants it passed in his first 100 days. The law makes sexual orientation and gender identity protected categories under civil rights law. Elevating public protections for LGBTQ activities diminishes protections for religious people and organizations. The Equality Act would define much of what churches and religious people and organizations do as public accommodations. So, religious schools, hospitals, and other ministries would be forced to operate under a gender ideology that violates the core of what they believe. They'd be required to take actions they know would seriously harm other human beings. Among them, the perpetration of medical atrocities on people uncomfortable with their God-given gender. The Equality Act is an egregious assault on religious liberty, but it goes further. It's an attack on what everyone sees. Margaret Harper McCarthy is a professor at John Paul II Institute. Her recent Wall Street Journal op-ed is entitled "The Equality Act is at War with Reality." At stake, she writes, is the freedom of rational human beings to use a common vocabulary when speaking about what all can see. This is not about theological beliefs like the Trinity. Rather, she writes, the Equality Act concerns things everyone can see and understand. Nursing babies know their mothers are the ones nursing them, not their fathers. Sexual difference is obvious. If truths about the human body are only beliefs, Professor McCarthy wonders, why object so vociferously to these particular beliefs? Her answer, because they make especially strong claims on us. There's a revolution that denies the obvious, denies the visible reality of two sexes, male and female. Its goal is to eliminate the distinction between the sexes. The professor says it is now at the doorstep. Believers should prepare, because those who believe in the invisible order are now the last custodians of the visible one. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Once again, Dr. Merrill Matthews, Penna Dexter with us. And Penna, I might just mention your commentary today is about the Equality Act. So we've encouraged people to contact their senators. I would imagine most people have done that, but if not, that's our take action item. To the left is your Viewpoints commentary, what everyone sees. And if you'd like to read it, you can go to the website right now. If you'd like to have it delivered in your inbox, there's a place where you can sign up. If you click on that button that says Read Now, Never miss a viewpoint. Sign up here, and you will receive Penna Dexter's commentaries in your inbox every
And your
Saturday.
commentaries also, right?
Mine Monday through Friday. Yours is on Saturday.
Yeah.
But tell us about that, because, again, you help us understand that there are all sorts of people on all sides of the political spectrum that are concerned about the Equality Act, aren't they?
Yeah, it's not, I mean, it's been, we speak about how much of an attack it is on religious liberties. Because when you redefine sex and you make sexual orientation and gender identity protected categories, then you, by definition, you are then abridging the rights of Christians to live as they choose on many issues. So Christians are very upset about it. But really, the point that I made, because I read a piece in the Wall Street Journal that made this point, is that this is an attack on what everyone sees and experiences. This is an attack. I mean, everyone can see that someone is a male or a female. And this bill tries to take that and muddy the waters. And I mean, this is amazing in a sense that they have actually been able to convince many, many people across the country that, there's no distinction, or people should be able to be fluid or switch their gender or have the surgery and all of that. That's denying the obvious. And so the point that was made by this writer in the Wall Street Journal, she's a professor at John Paul II Institute, I just thought it was good, because she said, if you're a believer and you're informed by your faith and in God, then we believers are the ones that actually have the responsibility right now to protect the whole society and culture from something like this, from being forced to have to violate what they can actually see with their own two eyes. And I just thought, it's so true. I mean, it's just common sense.
Well, again, great little commentary. And again, if that gives you a little more, if you will, intellectual ammunition for contacting your two senators, that's the case. But I did want to mention, Penna, while I'm talking to you, let's continue on with Victor Davis Hanson, Wealthy and Woke. And I love the line that he says, the rich and powerful grow more rich and powerful by scolding their inferiors while not practicing what they preach. And that seems to be the case. How many times have we said it seems like there are laws and rules that apply to you, but not to me?
Yeah, well, I mean, what gives the CEOs of companies like Delta or the football or the baseball league, what gives them the right to dictate to us what we think about race or what we think about protecting our elections? I mean, they seem to be, because they sell us things or offer us entertainment or offer us a flight somewhere, they seem to think that they have that right to bully people. And, it's really, I think the wokeness that we see in the culture, and Victor Davis Hanson makes this point, it comes from academia, it comes from Hollywood, it comes from these corporate executives and government. So we've got all these elites. It's not really something that the average American worries about or buys into, but until we have to worry about it.
And when you talk about the hypocrisy that goes on, the Hollywood elites all support things like minimum wage, living wage, things of that nature, and then they often make their movies in another country in order to be able to avoid exactly those things. I remember John Funds used to be with the Wall Street Journal, wrote a piece some time back with John Kerry, because John Kerry supports every major new tax increase that comes. He wrote a piece saying John Kerry docked his yacht in Rhode Island rather than Massachusetts because the taxes were cheaper there for yachts. And John Kerry's office responded, well, he's not breaking any laws. And John Funds said, I didn't say he was breaking any laws. You're just a hypocrite because you support every tax increase, but you do your best to try to avoid paying those very taxes that you support.
Well, again, a good example is this week we've kind of hit on this issue of climate change a couple of times, and we've talked about apocalypse never, not now, and some of these other things, and about the idea of a climate lockdown. But again, we have seen so many times individuals tell us that we certainly need to lower and reduce our carbon footprint while they are getting on their private jets flying off to these conferences telling us to lower our carbon footprint.
And one of the state think tank in Tennessee once gave Al Gore, they may still be doing it, a hard time because they would estimate how much his mansion there used in terms of electricity. And I can't remember, but it was like the same amount as several several thousand medium-sized houses would
Very
use in
true.
a year.
Yes.
And so they published that. Gore's people came back and said, well, he does use some solar panels and other things, but of course that doesn't cover you at night. It's once again, I'm fine with however big a house Al Gore wants to have, but Al Gore is a hypocrite on almost all of this stuff, and we just see it time and again. And I think people are fed up with this stuff.
I think so.
Well, they don't have to live with the consequences. I mean, on climate, too, they talk about fossil fuels, but the other types of fuel, wind and solar, first of all, they're not reliable. They need the backup. Second of all, right now, it's much more expensive. And so that's okay for them to, get their solar panels on every house they have and all of that. But it's not okay for the person that's living hand to mouth or, just trying to make that paycheck last to the end of the month. And then when you talk about border security, when they want to talk about the compassion for the people coming to our country, well, it's an invasion right now, and they're bringing in COVID, and they're, our government doesn't even know what to do about it. It's affecting the communities on the border and throughout the country as people are brought in that have to be taken care of and provided with services.
I think we hit a record last month, didn't we? I believe we hit a record.
Yeah.
And that sort of goes to Joe Biden, who said, this is just a seasonal change. No, Joe. If it's a record, it's not a seasonal influx.
So it doesn't affect them. And same with defunding the police, because they can have a wall and perhaps an armed guard at their home if they live in a dangerous area.
So again, the laws apply to you, but not to me. Mm-hmm. And I can live in a situation where they don't affect me. Just about out of time, and I always like to mention some of the great material at ipi.org. First of all, a lot of these articles on such issues as taxes, immigration, and a variety of others. And if it was this time in a normal year, we'd be talking about April 15th taxes. But now we've been able to move them back to May 17th. Mm-hmm. But nevertheless, one of the things you have posted there is the interview you did with Dan Pilla about what to do with your taxes. So that's another resource, which of course you've interviewed here. And so I would encourage people, if they're starting to think about their taxes, although they have another month now to postpone that.
Or 2 months if you're in Texas.
In Texas, yeah, because it goes, it's May 17th and then it's June 15th. So, that is the numbers, because I looked it up the other day, because everybody around the table in my office said, oh, I didn't know it was postponed. I said, well, that's because so many of them probably postponed anyway. But again, those resources, all sorts of other issues are on the website. And there's also an opportunity for them to watch some of the previous interviews you've done. You did one on the military this week, didn't you?
Right, yes. We did one with Lisa Hirschman, who is the second and the only woman who has been I think they called her the chief management officer of the Department of Defense. Saved us $37 billion, identified that much money, was able to save it.
So again, all of that is at ipi.org, and so if nothing else, go to that website to find that. Penna, Dexter, sure glad to have you back.
It's good to be back.
And again, I want to thank Andrew and Steve, and also Ivy, who is stepping in for Steve today to help us out. If you find yourself saying you have gone through this entirely too quickly, I'd like to hear it again, or I'd like to pass it on to someone else, you can click on that button that says listen and get the podcast, or watch, or even go to the YouTube channel. We've posted all the articles, and we encourage you to find those articles, print them out, and maybe pass them on to others. Have a great weekend. We look forward to seeing you back here on Monday, right here on Point of View.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.